Well, greetings. Welcome to Conversations, where we spend time discussing topics that really matter. My name is Adam DePasquale. I serve as one of the lead pastors here at Walnut Hill, and I am so excited to have with us just a special guest, a good friend of Walnut Hill, Gordon MacDonald. Now, many of you know Gordon as a longtime pastor, author, public speaker, even college chancellor. But today I'm excited to have a personal conversation with Gordon, the passionate lover of Jesus, the committed husband, father, and grandfather, the man who loves to invest deeply into relationships, and the man, using his own words, who has taken the time to look at the inner landscape of his life. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and welcome you, Gordon.
Thank you, Adam. It's great to be with you. I always love to come to Walnut.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, how are you and Gail doing?
We're doing just fine for people of our age. We're in good health. We can get out of the bed in the morning and look cheerfully to a brand new day. We have a lot of fun with each other. And so I would have to say, given our age, we're doing real well.
Well, you look great.
Thank you.
That's great. Well, we appreciate you joining us for this conversation. I'm going to just go ahead and introduce it. Amazingly, it was 2 years ago that you came to Walnut Hill, and it was during a year that we were focused on igniting faith. And we described that as really wanting to grow deeper in our relationships with Jesus and with one another. And I remember we had a conversation with you where we talked about how, when Jesus was here in his ministry, he spent considerable amount of time teaching people how to be in relationship with each other. And that if we're going to grow in Christ and be strong, we really have to be in community. So I remember when you came, you talked to us about the importance of having a mentor in our life. And you talked about the importance of investing into other people's lives. But we also launched a model that we call Cruise. And the whole idea is that you form a group of 3 to 5 people of the same gender, and you get together on a regular basis to encourage each other in faith, to really challenge each other to live fully for Christ. And I like to say to be a good steward of the relationships in your life, of the gifts that God's given you, of your time, of your money. And what's so cool is that now 2 years later, we just recently did a survey, and we found that about 50% of our congregation are in Cruise or crew-like relationships.
That's amazing.
It is, yeah.
That is really unique.
It's one of the things that probably makes Brian, Craig, and I most excited about what God's doing here. And what I love about it is that during this COVID season where we're social distancing, we've heard stories of people just staying connected with each other and supporting each other via Zoom and telephone and things like that. So, but what I'd love to do is facilitate a conversation with you around intentional relationships. And I'm thinking about it, and I know that there are some watching tonight who maybe have never been in an intentional relationship before in this way, and the thought of this just scares them half to death. And maybe others are listening and they think, well, I've been doing this for 10 years, and I'd love for them to be supercharged tonight in our conversation. But then I'm aware that there are some who maybe were hurt through relationships, and I hope that maybe our conversation can bring about some healing. So anyway, let's just jump right in. I'm just curious with you, how important have intentional relationships been in your life?
Well, they're extremely important. Maybe I have to start a little bit on a negative. I come out of a very unhappy home. My mother and father, I have no question about their love for me as a child in our family. But they really had not come out of a world where they knew how to love deeply in an intentional type of relationship. My father was a pastor, and he put his ministry, and he admitted this, he put his ministry first before the family. He would say many times, I've assumed that if I take care of God's church, then God will take care of my family. Well, that doesn't work very, very well. And so as I came up out of that home, I really went for some time not really understanding what a relationship of intentionality could be like. I had some good friendships as a child with other boys in the neighborhood, of course, but it was really not until I got into my university years that I began to understand that, first of all, you really can't go very deep in your Christian life without a cruise experience or something that would be called intentional. A solitary Christian life just doesn't work very well. And I had to learn that, I guess, almost the hard way. Because as I moved into my university years and I look back with some embarrassment, I was a person who used other people. I wasn't a person of my word. I wasn't a person who knew how to serve others. So there were some pretty painful consequences to my own ignorance as to what an intentional relationship would be. Fortunately, down through the years, God put into my life, in fact, I'm going to give you an exact number, 9 different people above all others, each one of which formed an intentional relationship with me that fit the need that I was at that particular point in my life. The first of those was a woman, a single woman, who took me under her wing when I was 4, 5, 6 years of age. And she taught me the Bible. And much of what I knew about the stories of the Bible over the years came from being mentored by her. Well, there are 8 others of a similar extraction that came all the way up through the years until just a few years ago. I only have one of those intentional relationships left now. The rest are all in heaven. But I was a 19, 20, 21-year-old before I began to realize how deeply important and significant having an intentional relationship or two would be.
So, okay, so that's really good. So you said you learned the hard way the importance of these relationships. How many years now do you think you've been making this a priority in your life?
Ask me that question again.
Well, so how many years now would you say you've been having these kinds of intentional relationships?
Well, I'm 81 years of age, and I would pick an arbitrary number that about the first significant adult intentional relationship came about the age of 21. So we're talking about 60 years in my own life of having men and women who were mentors to me, and in those years learning how to grow to be a mentor to other people. So mentoring goes in 2 different ways, and you know this. You should always have 2 or 3 or 4 people in your life who are feeding your growth. At the same time, as you move into the upper years of adulthood, you ought to have 2 or 3, 4 people in your life who you are feeding out of your experience and your wisdom. So we're talking about a 60-year period in which relationships have become very important to me. If I can add just a little addendum to that, it was in those years of my 20s and 30s that I made a discovery that I had never learned in my youthfulness, that if you don't have these relationships in your Christian life, it's almost impossible to grow to any depth whatsoever. Yeah. So when I finally became convinced of that, then I went out and deliberately found people who would be open to having a very special relationship with me and to whom I could look to for wisdom and knowledge and for spiritual growth. So almost all these years, I've been convinced that the Bible is a relational book, and that as you look down through the Older Testament and the New Testament, you see how many times the success of people in serving God depended upon the people they had around them in these special relationships. Let me give you just one example. The boy Samuel, who would never have made it one of Israel's greatest prophets if it hadn't been for Eli, who, by the way, was a failed father. But in his older years, God gives him the grace to have one more shot at Samuel as a boy. And it's Eli who helps Samuel figure out what the voice of God sounds like and how you respond when God's voice is heard. So Samuel owes Eli everything that makes him to become the powerful prophet in Israel that he became.
Yeah, absolutely. No, as you say that, I think about my life. It was definitely in my mid-20s late 20s, that I really saw the value of I'd say deep peer relationships. I had experienced that in high school to some degree, but probably left it behind for about 10 years. And I'm thankful for how that has changed the trajectory of my life. And then, of course, when Clive was here, he invested deeply in me for 12 years. And I'm a different person because of that.
It's wonderful to have those kind of people.
Mm-hmm. So when you think about this, how does a person go about finding these kinds of relationships? I've heard you've talked about capital F friends before. Like, how do you find people that you can go that deeply with? Because we know that it's not always that easy to find someone like that you connect with.
It can take a lot of time. When I began looking for my capital F friends as a young adult male, I think it took 3 or 4 years to establish the quality of relationship that qualifies for what I call special F. A special F relationship is one in which each partner in the relationship knows the depths of the other person's heart. I know a lot of wonderful people that I function with, meals, picnics, play, projects that we're all on, but we really don't know each other's heart. But every once in a while, there comes along someone and you feel that your hearts kind of leap at each other. Those come very rarely, and they take a lot of time and a lot of intentionality. I would bet that I've only had 12 or 15 special F relationships over a lifetime. Now, Adam, you asked, how do those make? Well, I smile and I say, well, how did you meet your wife? If you look at most of us, when we fell in love and established the intentional relationship that's called marriage, what did we do? We had a mental list of people of the other gender that we thought just might qualify. And we take them out for coffee, we treat them to lunch, we start go out on dates, and we just watch each other, and we give and take on interesting topics, controversies, spiritual life. How do you feel about money? What do you do for fun? And little bit by little, there's a welding that begins to happen between two people. And finally, one day, one of them has the courage to say to the other one, we have something special going here, don't we? And that eventuates for what we call marriage. I think the same thing happens in mentoring relationships. You make a mental list of, if you're a man, 10 or 12, 13 other men who are, in that case, maybe a few years older than you are, a little bit more mature. They've seen a little bit of life that you haven't yet seen. The smartest thing when you meet a person like that is to say, I'd like to buy you breakfast. I have a few questions I'd like to ask. Maybe you could answer them. And if the conversation goes well, we say, could we do this in another month? You meet a second month, third month. And finally, 8, 9, 10 months down the road, one of you might say to the other, I'm getting a real kick out of this relationship. It's fun to talk with you. You bring so much to the table. Could we just get a relationship going where we meet regularly the 4th Saturday of every month, which one might be a possibility? I have 2 friends, even right now, that the 3 of us have breakfast together at 7:35 every Friday morning, and we haven't missed for the longest time. Of course, during this period of the virus, we're having to do it by Zoom. But even in Zoom, we haven't stopped meeting it. I know that every Friday morning, the 3 of us will be somewhere we connect with each other. But it took about 4 or 5 years to forge that relationship until both of you said, this guy knows my heart. I know the kind of questions to ask him. I know the kind of questions he can answer for me. I'm not ashamed to talk to him about my walk with Jesus. He's the first go-to person I would go outside of my marriage and family if I had to get some advice and counsel. All sorts of possibilities. So the dating relationship works more than just in marriage. I think it works in mentoring also.
Yeah, no, when you say that, I think about my life, and I have a few different crew kinds of groups, and one of them has been going for about 15 years. I'm just so blessed. And it's almost every week that 3 of us have gotten together, and now it's by phone as well, or FaceTime. But I remember the first time I saw the gentleman, it was from a distance, and I thought, I'd like to get to know him. And and sometimes you have to put yourself out there, right? And you say, hey, you want to get together, and
the worst thing you can do, Adam, is to go to that person and say, would you be my mentor? Could we have breakfast together every Thursday morning for the next 10 years? You're going to scare a lot of people if you do that. This is something you just do. You don't call up a young woman and say, I'd like to marry you. You may have that in your mind, but it's going to take some time for that person to realize that you're a serious possibility in terms of a lifelong relationship.
Yeah. And you can pray, right? You can actually say, God, this is
You
something
can,
I deeply desire in my life, right?
well, the most important capital F friend relationship I have is the one I have with Gail. We've been married next year 60 years. I met Gail through a trusted friend, actually an earlier mentor, who said to me one night, I've met a woman that I think would make you an incredible wife. Well, with words like that, you start listening. And he described her to me, and I finally said, how soon could I meet her? And to make this story very short, we met her the next day for a meal. And 3 weeks later, we were engaged, and 4 months later, we were married. So that's how fast this can go.
Yeah.
The setting is right. And by the way, that person who introduced us was a mentor to both of us. And the fact that he put his stamp of approval on the relationship made it very easy to go fast and to make that thing cement itself very quickly.
That's good. Let's just press into this a little bit further. Like maybe we've all been in relationships before, even it could be a marriage or dating as well, where it starts to get stale, and I think about a crew-like relationship where you're meeting with a group of people and you go through seasons where it's vibrant and seasons where it's not so much. Do you have any just tips about what do you do in a crew-like group when you're having breakfast together? What's a good use of time? How do you make sure that it doesn't just turn into talking about the game the other night or whatever it might be?
Well, that's a real danger. And I've been impressed with how many Christian conversations rarely ever reach the level of Jesus. Exactly as you put it a moment ago, it becomes about the Patriots or some other team, if there is any other team. And, it can dwindle into politics or something in the New York Times or the newspaper. So in almost every crew relationship, and this is just my observation, there's someone who kind of stands out and everybody gives that person a little bit of power to shape the conversation. The men that I meet with on Friday mornings, they seem to do that to me. No one's ever said, Gordon, you lead this group. But there are frequent comments that make me recognize that these men look to me to kind of set the pace of the topic on a particular Friday morning. So when I'm on my way to have breakfast with my friends, I try to think, what are the 3, 4, 5 things this week that have happened that we may want to talk about? And if we talk well, we're going to leave the table strengthened, encouraged, and better directed. Mm-hmm. So, the first question at the table might be, well, how's your week? And, last Friday you told us you had to do this particular thing. How did it go? How do you feel about it? Where did you find God in the middle of it to give you the courage and the direction you needed? What have you read in the scripture in the last week? You don't want to embarrass people with a question like that. Give them plenty of latitude. What have you read in the scripture or any place that has particularly provoked your thinking? That's an interesting question that one might ask. But I always accept responsibility in the Friday morning to be kind of the pace setter as to where that conversation is going to go. And it doesn't all have to be hyper serious conversation, but it ought to lead someplace so that an hour and a half later, when you all leave the table, each of you is feeling, I'm a little bit more assured right now that God is in control of my life.
Yeah. Yeah, for me, it's interesting is when you go to the place and conversation becomes so deep because you start to bring to your crew major decisions you're making in life and real questions you have. And a vulnerability opens up to where the conversations are just about the kingdom and about our lives. And I think so often they start with the primers that you're talking about. But then you're really looking for almost like, God, what are you doing in this conversation right now? What's the most important thing we talk about? And I know I've been in settings before in my crew where the whole time ends up being about one person because they just need a listening ear with something challenging they're going through. And it's so easy to miss that if we're not listening, right, to the real needs in that moment.
Yeah, you're putting your finger on an important point right there, Adam, and that's there are going to be times when some person is going to dominate the circle because they're just going through a very difficult moment. But if week after week after week, if it starts to become all about one person over and over again, you're probably doing damage to the relationship. It's got to be balanced between all of the members of the circle. And once again, some woman or some man is probably going to be a little bit more the leader than anybody else. One of the things they have to watch is everybody getting an opportunity to sound their voice in this conversation? Is somebody dominating the conversation and kind of turning us all into listeners while they do all the talking? The leader of the group is going to be sensitive to those kind of things so that he or she makes sure that when the morning is over, everybody's had a chance to make a contribution to the group. Yeah. I don't want to belabor this because it's a whole subject in yourself, but groups are made up of extroverts and introverts. And if allowed, the extroverts have a tendency to dominate the conversation, and the introverts more and more retreat into themselves. I'm always watching for that. And if I see an introvert or two that are becoming just constantly quiet, I may suddenly say, Adam, I'm watching you. Your face shows curiosity. What's going on in your mind right now? What are you thinking about? Or another question, what are you hearing? When Bob spoke, Adam, what did you hear from him? So that you're making sure that the introverts and quiet people are brought into the conversation and no one dominates the space all the time.
Yeah, that's really good. I was blessed that early on when this kind of crew-like relationship began with me, I was just starting ministry, and my wife and I had kind of received a encouraging word from a pastor saying, relationships are going to be important for you guys. You have to have accountable relationships. And so we made a commitment early on that Carrie blessed me to say, you can have conversations about our relationship, about our family. And we've had a commitment with each other where we will never talk to someone else about what's happening in our family if we haven't talked to each other first. So that's a commitment we have. We have a commitment to honor each other and always speak well of each other. But we've blessed each other to be able to have honest conversations about how things are going. And it's been such a help. I remember this one night, I was early in ministry and I was working too much, still learning how to balance ministry, which I think probably we're still doing now. But Carrie looked at me. We had like a 6-month-old, and she said, "You're working too much, and I'm going to call AJ and Bryn." And I remember it made me bust into laughing, and we both started laughing because it was kind of funny. And I said, "You know what? Let's do that." Because I realized that we really need people in our life who care about us that much that that they'll tell us the truth. But what I loved is that early on, my wife began to see the value of this crew in my life and how it was having a benefit on our family, which is pretty cool, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
One of the mistakes that I made as a younger man was I assumed that Gail was capable of meeting every one of my needs for intimacy of any type and level. So I didn't work hard at developing capital F male friendships in the first 15 years of my life, adult life. And when people would say, "Do you have any best friends?" I'd say, "Well, I don't need any. Gail's my best friend." What I came to realize as the years went by is I was putting an undue burden upon her. Gail's a woman. She's a wife. And she does what wives do, as husbands ought to do on the other side. And what I realized was that in my lack of capital F friendships for a while there with other men, I was leaving myself vulnerable. There are things that men understand about men that women don't necessarily understand. And of course, it works both ways. So capital F friendships ought to be bigger than just marriage. There ought to be, I'm going to bet it can't go beyond 5, but there ought to be 3 to 5 men in my life that provide a certain kind of male intimacy that women wouldn't be necessarily interested in. And of course, I have to keep saying vice versa because it works the other direction too. Yeah. But I was almost 40 years of age, Adam, before I figured that out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. No, I can relate with that. And I think, when I'm thinking about these relationships, I'm thinking about how so often you have to invite people into your life. And what I mean by that is like, I'll oftentimes sit with people and I'll share something. And unless I say to them, I need to know what you honestly think about what I just shared. In fact, I'm going to be angry if I leave this conversation and find out later that you thought I should never have done that. Like, I need to know right now. And I think there's an importance of being that blunt with each other sometimes when you're looking for input into your life. And have you found that to be true with yourself?
I'm not sure I can fully answer that question. Reshape it for me.
Well, I mean, like, for instance, there was a decision I was making not too long ago, and I really needed wisdom on it. And I'm just very familiar that in Christian circles, so often you share something and people kind of smile and they say, that sounds great. And even your friends.
Yeah.
And there are times that you just have to pause and say, I'm really honestly asking you for your input right now. And I need to know if you think this is a good decision or a bad decision. In fact, I won't be happy, if you're not telling me the truth.
Let me give you an example of a time when I faced that. I got into a conversation one day, this is a number of years back, with a man. If I mentioned his name, a large part of your congregation would know the name immediately. And we got on a topic where there was a little bit of tension between the two of us. And the words between us, I don't want to exaggerate this thing, but there was a little bit of heat in the room, if you get my drift. And finally, he said to me something that shocked me. He said, Gordon, I sense there's some real bitterness in your heart. I think you need to do something about this. Well, he had no way of knowing that he probably had quieted me in the most dramatic way possible, because my father was a bitter man almost all of his life. And when I was younger, I determined I would never allow anger or bitterness to store itself inside of me, because I knew what it looked like from watching my dad. And I was scared to death that kind of thing could be in me. So this man says, I sense some bitterness in your heart. And I said to him, well, I'm going to stop the conversation right here, and I'm going to go and I'm going to think about what you just said. Because if you're correct, then I have a real issue to deal with. So thank you for volunteering that information. Let me go away and think about it. So I went home, and a few days later, I gathered my capital of friends, 3 at a time, and I told them what had happened. And I said, guys, you've seen me in almost every kind of situation, good and bad. I would appreciate it if you would together take a month, go out to breakfast with each other. I'll pay the bill for you. But I want you to go and talk about me together and ask the question among yourselves, have we seen any signs in Gordon's life of bitterness or anger? Because if you know that stuff is there and you haven't told me, you've done me a terrible disfavor. So they agreed to do that. And I don't know how many times they got together, but about a month later, one of them called and said, Gordon, we're ready to get together with you and talk about your question. We sat down over lunch, and the leader of the group said, we did what you asked us to do. We spent time looking over the last 2 or 3 years. Does Gordon have any sign of anger or bitterness in him? And then they said this. The answer is no, you don't. We were quite thorough, and we don't see any anger or bitterness in you. You can be free of that accusation. Well, there you've got a positive plus example of what friends can do for each other. We all need to have people in our lives who help us to understand how we come across, not just in the bad moments where we need to be corrected and rebuked, but in the good moments where we need to be affirmed and where we need to know from others that God truly is in us, growing us, and that he's liberating us from some of the earlier sinful patterns we might have had.
That's really good. I mean, that's an incredible gift. And I think what I was trying to get at, you got perfectly at, which is sometimes we have to invite that kind of feedback, and we have to be so direct about it. It makes all the difference. People need permission, right? And
yep.
And that's really good. Let me ask you a question. Has a group you've ever been involved in gone bad, where you had to do damage control and repair relationships, or what do you do if something happens in the group that threatens the unity of the group or the health of the group?
Well, yeah, I can think of a group many, many, many years ago that went bad. Um, and it was largely because I didn't explain to the people what the purpose of the group was. Furthermore, I didn't make any effort to help people to understand how a group works together. Um, Groups of the type that you and I are discussing just don't happen any more than a marriage happens without a man and a woman ever talking to each other about what are the dynamics of our relationship, what are the rules by which we're going to live together. And you have to do the same in a cruise group. You have to talk about how is this group going to function? What's our mission going to be? When we get together, this is, again, to repeat myself, this is not to discuss the Patriots, but it's to enjoy the richness of God's aliveness in our hearts in the more serious levels of life. So how are we going to make that happen? How are we going to talk with each other? What's going to happen if we disagree with each other? We started out talking about some people that were in disagreement with each other. And how does the leader help people to find reconciliation at that particular point? How do we handle a heated conversation? That kind of stuff that needs to be done, talked about up front before it comes in without warning and does damage to the relationship. So the relationship I'm thinking about happened maybe when I was in my early 30s, and I didn't make any effort to tell the people what the group was for. And what they did was they assumed that Gail and I just liked them, that this was to be, a fun time together, and we would just all wonderfully function with one another. And then one day, Gail and I said, this group isn't going well. And people said, this is a group? This is what we were sweating. They had no idea the motives and the mission of the group was so different in their mind than our mind. So from that point forward, I learned a hard lesson that if I was ever going to bring friends together for any particular purpose, I would always make sure we all understood what the ground rules of the relationship were and where we thought it might be going.
That's really good. I think that's really important. Well, if you had a word to say to, hundreds of groups that are meeting right now and a way to encourage them, what would you say to encourage them today?
How would I encourage them? I guess I would talk about being faithful to one another, seeking one another's growth. That's probably what's at the root of Christian intentional relationships. We're all coming into this circle to help each other to grow in Christ-likeness. That's one of the things which the Scriptures talks about with a lot of frequency. The purpose of the church and in the subgroups in that church is to help everyone to be more like Christ on a daily basis. So in that group, we've got to make sure that we look around the circle. We don't have to like each other all equally, but we are committed to one another's growth to whatever extent that that's possible. Be faithful, be growth-oriented, and I think, by the way, do a lot of laughing. And there's got to be some fun, enjoyment, and fun in this thing, so that every once in a while the group functions by saying, let's spend an evening or let's spend a day and we'll do this or that. And simply enjoy one another. It doesn't all have to be hyper serious.
That's really good. That's excellent. Well, it's amazing. 30 minutes have already gone by just talking about this. It's been a wonderful time together. And I want to thank you for encouraging us as a community. It's really, really crucial.
Thank you, Adam.
Yeah. And for everyone watching tonight, I just want to encourage you, if this is something you've never been a part of, I want to encourage you to begin to pray about the capital F friends that the Lord will bring in your life. And then take a risk like Gordon described. Take a risk and reach out to someone and begin to test the waters there. I think a great thing to do is get involved with a small group, get involved with a men's group or a women's group. Sometimes you meet people in smaller settings. And so take the next step to get into a smaller group. If you've been meeting as a crew for some time, Brian, Craig, and I are just so proud of you. And we pray for you. We encourage you. We want you to just keep going because we believe the Lord has tremendous plans for your life. And he wants to use you in ways that you would never get there by yourself. You need the encouragement of other Christ followers to be able to take the bold steps of faith that he's calling you to. So we want to encourage you to do that. Well, please join us next week for next week's conversation. And just God bless you. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.